And in a second, I do want to discuss what happened at the UN, because that was a major development over at the UN yesterday with Nikki Haley really taking charge. Yesterday, as I said, Nikki Haley acting as my spirit animal, and she was at the UN. The UN votes 128-9 against the United States moving our embassy to Jerusalem, to which we say, go to hell. Who cares what you have to say? Why in the world would I care that Yemen doesn't want us to move our embassy to Jerusalem? Like, Yemen can kiss our ass. Who cares? Answer, no one. No one. Okay, and Nikki Haley made that pretty clear. She basically looked at the entire UN and she said, guys, you think I'm standing here, like, caring about what you guys have to say? Welcome to America. Nikki Haley doing yeoman's work over at the UN. It's always weird. Whenever people speak at the UN, it looks like they're speaking in the bathroom at a Macy's. But in any case, here's Nikki Haley really bashing people about the head.
The United States is by far the single largest contributor to the United Nations and its agencies. When a nation is singled out for attack in this organization, that nation is disrespected. What's more, that nation is asked to pay for the privilege of being disrespected. The United States will remember this day in which it was singled out for attack in the General Assembly for the very act of exercising our right as a sovereign nation. We will remember it when we are called upon to once again make the world's largest contribution to the United Nations. And we will remember it when so many countries come calling on us, as they so often do, to pay even more and to use our influence for their benefit.
Cut them off. Cut them off. Cut them off. Okay, none of these countries that are voting against the United States ought to take their foreign aid for granted. Now, there are two types of foreign aid that the United States grants. It represents foreign aid, by the way, about 1% of the American federal budget every year. What's breaking the bank is not foreign aid, but we can use this as a tool. You know, we give like $100 million to Zimbabwe every year, like in human and development aid, in health and development aid. We give, it says like $135 million every year to Zimbabwe, which was until 5 minutes ago run by Robert Mugabe, one of the worst people on planet Earth. There have been studies that show that foreign aid does virtually nothing. When you sign a check to a dictator, the dictator takes the check, immediately cashes it, builds himself a new palace, buys himself a couple of new female bodyguards, and then goes about his daily business, by stooping the bodyguards and murdering his own people. Foreign aid, unless it is specifically channeled to the right areas, doesn't do a whole hell of a lot. And the UN doesn't do a whole hell of a lot. The idea of attaching strings to the system makes a lot of sense. Now, what's funny is that there are people on the left who don't believe this. So Philip Mudd is one of these people. He's his name is Mudd, literally. And he actually says this on CNN. He said that Trump was acting in the form of diplomatic prostitution. He said, let me be blunt here, Wolf. He said this to Wolf Blitzer. This is diplomatic prostitution. We're telling people, unless you vote with us, we're not going to give you money. And if your heart doesn't agree with American policies, we're not going to support you in terms of U.S. aid. That's not prostitution. It's just called diplomacy. Like, we actually get to attach strings to the checks that we sign to people. It's true everywhere, by the way. It's true in domestic policy, too. No such thing as a free lunch internationally or nationally. But what this really betrays is that there are a lot of people in the United States, living in the United States, who do not actually see the United States as a force for good in the world. They see it as a bad thing. They see it as a bad thing when we exert our power in the world. That's because there are really two different views of America on the world stage. View number one is that America is a big bully. This was Barack Obama's view in his apology tour early on in his presidency, that America is the big bully on the world stage. We're mean to people and cruel. We're overreaching. We're sort of a bull in a china shop. Sure, we try to do the right thing, but we usually do the wrong thing. And then there is the more traditional and correct view of America's role in the world, which is that we are the greatest force for freedom the world has ever seen and ever known. And the fact is, where American boots have set foot, freedom follows. I'm not going to talk about whether we should have been in every war that we've been in, but where America was present, there was freedom, and where America was removed, the freedom went away. This is true in Vietnam, where when we pulled out of Vietnam, South Vietnam, a free country, turns into a communist hellhole. So does Cambodia. And Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge end up murdering 1 million people. Right? When we pull out of Korea, out of North Korea is still a prison camp 60-odd years later. Right? South Korea, where we still have troops, is one of the freest, most prosperous countries in Asia. Forget about Europe, right? I mean, all of Europe would be speaking German right now if it weren't for the United States, including Britain. So the idea that the United States has been a nefarious force on the world stage, or that we have strings attached, we should have strings attached because our strings are good. Right? Our strings are usually things like, we would like you to free up your press. We would like you to not oppress women. We would like for you to support United States foreign policy in strengthening our interests around the world. This is good stuff. The United States has never conquered nations to take them. The United States has conquered nations in order to replace regimes with better regimes. Ask how that's gone for Japan and Germany. The answer is pretty well. And by the way, it was going a lot better in Iraq until President Obama decided to precipitously withdraw from Iraq, leaving in his wake an Iranian-backed regime and ISIS in the west of the country, in the northwest of the country. So this view that the United States is being terrible by attaching strings to our funds, it's my money. For God's sake, it's my money. So if it's my money, then I get to determine what happens with it. This notion that the government has a role in taking my money and then spending it on whatever stupid thing Robert Mugabe wants to spend it on, it verges on taxation without representation, is the truth. Now, one of the things that's always interesting is the UN votes, as I talked about yesterday, statistically, insanely and routinely, all the time, they vote against Israel. And a huge percentage of all the votes they've ever taken in the UN General Assembly are against Israel. And the people who vote against Israel are typically, there are a lot of people who abstained yesterday. The people who voted against Israel are largely located in areas with large Muslim populations, Europe, or in the Muslim world itself. So the vote, I say, was 128-9. So 57 of those countries were Islamic. So half of them right off the bat are Muslim countries that hate Israel and don't believe that it ought to exist. And then there are another 50-odd countries, and some of those are in Asia, and some of those are in Europe. And what you are seeing is this alliance between members of the European left and radical Islam to condemn Israel. Right? This is where anti-Semitism exists. I've talked about anti-Semitism before on the program. There are a few different types. There's religious anti-Semitism, which is sort of Muslim anti-Semitism at this point. There's still some Christian anti-Semitism, but that's become far less of a problem over the last 50 years since the Holocaust. There is, or over the last 70 years since the Holocaust, rather. There is Muslim anti-Semitism, so religious anti-Semitism. There's also secular anti-Semitism in the form of people who do not like Christianity, do not like Judaism. They're okay with Islam because Islam makes them feel all multicultural and special and warm inside, but they're not big on the Juden. And this is coming out in Europe. So there's a piece in USA Today talking about Germany. Germany voted against the United States moving our embassy to Jerusalem. Again, none of their damn business. Again, they'd be speaking Hitler if it weren't for us. But the idea that Germany is going to tell Israel, a country full of Jews, right, about the same population of Jews, come to think of it, as were slaughtered in the Holocaust by the Germans and their allies, that they're going to tell Israel where to put their capital is beyond absurd. The anti-Semitism in Germany is on the rise. In Europe, it's on the rise. So if you wonder if the anti-Israel motivation is caused by anti-Semitism, the answer is yes. European anti-Semitism has long roots. Now, there's a lot of European anti-Semitism that's based off of new Muslim migrants and also secular leftists who believe that Israel is a nefarious force for Western imperialism. So there's a piece in USA Today. When telecommunications manager Mikhail Tanayev emigrated to Germany in 1998 from his native Russia as a teen, his Jewish faith didn't matter to classmates or neighbors. But now, he says, when I arrived in Germany, I never saw such displays, but now there are thousands of people who are burning Israeli flags in the streets. In 2006, Germany recorded 1,500 anti-Semitic incidents. That was a massive increase from previous years. According to a recent survey in Western Germany, 62% of Jewish respondents said they experienced anti-Semitism in their everyday lives. 28% said they were victims of verbal attacks or harassment in the past year. When I visited France, my wife and I were afraid to go in particular districts while I was wearing a yarmulke. I wore a baseball cap instead. When I was in London, I think I've told this story on the show. When I was in London, there was a situation where we went to Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. We were walking around, looking at all the statues. No Jewish statues, right, except for Albert Einstein. And behind us, there's a group of young Muslims. You can tell because the woman's wearing a hijab. She's surrounded by two guys who also look like they are from Muslim countries. And they actually walk up to the statue of Albert Einstein and start strangling it. And I figured, well, maybe they just don't like the theory of relativity. Turns out not. There's also a wax statue of Hitler. And while every British person there was walking over and strangling Hitler, these young Muslims went over and put their arms around Hitler like he was Uncle Hitler and began taking pictures. Anti-Semitism is on the rise there. It's on the rise in places like Sweden, not just because of radical Islam, but also because of a secular movement that sees religious education as backwards and non-progressive. Nordic countries maintain opinion corridors for acceptable ideas in the public square, and those opinion corridors do not include religious people very often. So anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiment It may be true that not everyone anti-Israel is anti-Semitic, but everyone anti-Semitic is certainly anti-Israel, and there is pretty significant crossover between the two groups.